So it looks like my internet is just proceedings, but I'll go ahead and try anyways. Unless someone else wants to give a shot at intuition right now. That's the only part of your questions I heard, unless there's something before that, because it cut off in the middle there. Okay, so intuition. Um, yeah, what does he mean? I think to some degree, it's kind of like synthesis is the right word, but it's sort of a commonality between intellect and instinct that's more in the vein of instinct by the fact that it's close to the movement of life. But I see it more as kind of when he talks about the original vital impulse, the élan vital, he says that there was already all these tendencies kind of wrapped up as potentials, as, virtual potentials of multiplicity. And then from there, you already had instinct and intelligence kind of mixed in with each other. So I see intuition as a kind of way. So eventually they separated, because that's how essentially the vital impulse works, is through divergence. But this divergence, it separated instinct and intelligence. And from there, this intuition is a kind of melding them back together according to their natural kind of lines of articulation, in a sense. Even though I think he is stressing that it is very much more geared towards instinct in terms of, evolutionary life and whatnot. So that's my initial answer.
So yeah. This is on the bottom of 176, and with the edition I have, it's kind of like in the middle of the reading. Unfortunately, anyway, it's the beginning of the section called Life and Consciousness. He says, it is to the very inwardness of life that intuition leads us. By intuition, I mean instinct that has become disinterested, self-conscious, capable of reflecting on its object and of enlarging it indefinitely. So I don't know if it's kind of a definition, and it sounds like it's like instinct that has become self-conscious or something, but I mean, what's difficult for me to understand about that quotation is when I read things like disinterested, self-conscious, incapable of reflection, that sounds like stuff that the intellect does. So that confuses me.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, I think it's a sort of instinct that maybe follows the positive qualities of intellect. And then there's a part where he talks about how intellect is what allowed us to kind of be freed from our consciousness, in a sense. So like not freed from our consciousness, but like freed from unconsciousness, basically. Intellect was the thing that allowed us to kind of change and be different from animals, but that we've kind of taken that intellect and assumed that transcends instincts, or that transcends kind of the animal way of life. And so we've kind of taken that and said, okay, intelligence is this great thing that we have that other things don't have, so let's use that and focus on it entirely. And I think instinct obviously has its own problems because of because it doesn't necessarily, it can't be analyzed, it can't be used in the specific way that we want to. So my understanding is that intuition is kind of just a reconciliation between them, analyzing what connects them, and then kind of trying to understand that. But and it reminds me a lot of like this section right after he mentions intuition. He talks a lot about perception and how there's a certain kind of sympathy that we're interacting with these objects. Like there's the whole, but then there are parts, and we don't really understand how the parts connect to the whole. And so to me, it's kind of this vague idea that isn't really fully formed in Bergson, but I think he sees that as like the key to kind of maybe not transcending intelligence, but dealing with the problems that intelligence brings.
Yeah, I think there's some really good points to really bring it out. I think in particular, the idea that it's kind of taking from the intellect the ability to kind of go outside itself, to seek things externally, to try to know the other in some way. Yeah, but the problem with the intellect is that it can only treat things in a very limited way, which is basically the whole thing he talks about, ad nauseum, continuously, about mechanism and whatnot. But so he's basically taking the aspect of instinct that is just kind of at home with its own movement and duration as a living force, and with its own natural organization, how those are kind of complementary as well, and it's extending that outside of oneself onto something else. So one way that he kind of talks about doing this, so one example that is in this book earlier, is when he talks about the sugar cube dissolving in the water. That in itself, so the sugar cube being placed in the water, dissolving, that's basically a kind of rhythm of itself. There's something about its kind of inner organization that is a rhythm that coordinates with also the water and everything else. And then the way that we are waiting on the sugar cube to dissolve, that's also kind of duration. It shows the contrast in these kind of rhythms of the sugar cube for itself, and then our impatience as a kind of duration also. So duration. So I think the intuition is a kind of it's sort of a sympathy by trying to tune in to other durations, actually by tuning into yours first and then seeing how there's other durations implied within your own. So he talks about, so I read the Stanford, the online Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article on Bergson. They have a kind of a sub section called just like the method of intuition, I believe. And one case they talk about, the color orange. You can think of the color orange as just, this simple given, it's there, it's orange. But then there's another way of seeing it where you kind of tune into its like vibrational, durational aspects, and you see that it's actually a kind of state of tension between these extremes of red and yellow, and how you can actually kind of then sense these other aspects of orange within orange, and then you can go on and on from there. So you get orange first, and then red and yellow. Then from red, you can get other colors that are kind of within that same continuum, and I guess expanded indefinitely. So there's some kind of sense that by connecting with your own duration, your own rhythm, with another duration, that goes along with this movement of life that I think he's talking about. But unlike instinct, it actually can apply it to other durations in a more explicit way.
So I was looking at this example. In this edition, it's the top of 174. It's a few paragraphs before that section, Life and Consciousness. about one of these creepy wasps that do creepy things to other bugs. And but now this is instinct. This isn't intuition, so it's different, I guess. But he's talking about the wasp that has to sting. It's the caterpillar in 3 different places, and then like crush its head in order to keep it alive, but yet still paralyzing it. And that seems like an awful lot of knowledge to have to master. Is you sting it in these 3 exact places and crush its head. At least I think that's the one. But he says this seems like it would like this would be unlikely to have evolved. But then he says this feeling of vulnerability, the vulnerability of the victim, this feeling of vulnerability might owe nothing to outward perception, but result from the mere presence together of the Ammophilia and the caterpillar, considered no longer as 2 organisms, but as two activities. It would express in a concrete form the relation of the one to the other. And I don't know how literally to take that. We've talked about whether Bergson is sort of a panpsychist or a hylozoist. I don't know, so like Chase, when you were talking about like duration, being able to feel the duration of the other somehow from within your own, this sounds like that the insect is actually extending its feeling. So when he says that he means sympathy in the literal sense, I guess he means feeling with, or feeling along with, or something. That it sounds like he's actually saying, if I take this literally, that the wasp feels the caterpillar from the inside in a sense. And I don't know if I should take that literally, or if it's more like by reflecting on its own, somehow it grasps the other. But because of the relation between instinct and intuition that other quotation suggests, I'm wondering if he thinks that there's some sort of potential for intuition to because he says intuition is also a kind of sympathy, I think. I mean, instinct definitely is a sympathy, a feeling with. But I'm wondering does he think that intuition actually provides, if he's a panpsychist and a hylozoist, does he think that intuition is something that allows people potentially to kind of drop down into a level of awareness that is more unitive in a sort of metaphysical sense, and kind of sense the movement of life in a broader sense rather than just as it's restricted to this particular individual? And that's a speculation on my part. And maybe he's going to answer that. He's going to answer that when he gets to the metaphysics part. But I just wondering, to what degree is he suggesting something like that?
I mean, that certainly seems to be what he's trying to open up space for in a lot of different ways, right? Like he's very insistent on this critique of Darwinian natural selection, and a large part of that seems to be opening up this space for there has to be, right? He's basically trying to demonstrate by exhausting all of the counter possibilities, right? Demonstrating that they don't work, that there has to be this sort of space in which different entities can like you were saying, on like a panpsychist plane, sort of interact with one another and understand each other more fundamentally. And then he seems to be using concepts like instinct, like intuition, like common sense to articulate this possibility. So I think your speculation is correct, or I see everything that he's arguing and all of the kind of hills that he's dying on. If I'm allowed to editorialize a little bit about his claims regarding Darwin, all seem to be pointing in the direction that what you're describing is what he's going to aim for.
So I heard barely any of that. I think I heard the word panpsychism. Sorry, could somebody give me like a a summary of what Sean just said, maybe in the chat or something?
Was I difficult to hear for everyone, or was this specifically for Chase?
No, yeah, I think it was just Chase.
Okay. Can I? I'll work on summarizing that. If people want to move on.
I was just gonna say that I think that intuition is a sort of sympathy, but I think it's maybe directed in a certain way, like a controllable sympathy that isn't just towards something like that is for our survival. You know, maybe it could be something that can be used in certain ways to develop our understanding of our own situation, and then maybe our broader role and kind of evolution in general. But I think that that's kind of like sympathy and intelligence are both kind of these valuable things, and intuition lies in kind of the way that they can work together. But yeah,
I think that, well, I think that you reminded me of a thing that Bergson said, which is that intuition is a disinterested instinct. It's instinct that does not depend on survival. That's exactly right. And I feel like for me, like maybe I don't have the concept totally wrapped up in my mind, but I think that what you're saying, and what you're saying is given credence by what Bergson says when he says that intuition is exemplified in things like aesthetics, you know, where it's like we have a sympathy, but it has nothing to do with our immediate practical necessity, right? It's a sympathy which is self-conscious and capable of reflecting upon its object and enlarging it indefinitely. And that's why we do things like we see art and beauty and we say that it's good for some reason. You know, we have this sympathy, this intuition towards it. You know what I mean? But I don't think that the wasp, and I might be wrong, but I don't think that the wasp has a sense of intuition toward the caterpillar necessarily.
Well, yeah, I don't disagree with that. What I was saying is that since he seems to connect intuition and instinct, like again, by intuition I mean instinct that's become disinterested, self-conscious, and capable of reflecting. What I meant was there may be, insofar as they're similar, that maybe he's proposing not that the insect has intuition, but the way that the instinct functions in the insect may be similar to the way he thinks intuition functions in intelligent beings. And the question was, does it give us I mean, it's like in the extreme, it would be like telepathy, except at the level of feeling rather than, you know, mind reading. So does it give us the ability, at least to some limited degree, to kind of feel with other things in a kind of literal way? And that's what is it literal, or is it just more figurative? Or, you know, I'm reminded of in Beyond Good and Evil 36, when a very famous passage when Nietzsche says, if we were going to speculate about metaphysics, we should probably start with what is closest to us, what we have immediate experiential access to, and that is the way these instincts and drives, you know, push us from within, and that we can feel that directly. And if we and then he says something like, the conscience of method requires us to take this experiment seriously and wonder whether that is giving us a direct access to the sort of metaphysical structure of reality, so that maybe this sense of instinct is a instinct, drives, and feelings are sort of a manifestation under which drives all of reality. And, you know, it's in a speculative mode, but it's that kind of thing that makes me wonder, you know, is it just, well, I have this, and since I feel this, I can imagine that those other things feel that too? Or is he saying that, no, there's a way, like I said before, of sort of dropping down into this level of sympathy where I can literally feel the movement of life, not only within myself, but in other regions around me?
I was looking at, again, on page like 176, 77, when he kind of starts getting more into it. I guess a phrasing that has been sticking out to me is when he talks about it being like a generalized instinct, whereas instinct focuses like on that one thing, while intuition is, it's disinterested, it's generalized. On page 177, a little above halfway down, he says, we can conceive an inquiry turned in the same direction as art. This is after he mentions the aesthetic intuition, which attains only the individual. But we can conceive of an inquiry turned in the same direction as art, which would take life in general for its object, just as physical science, and following to the end the direction pointed out by external perception, prolongs the individual facts into general laws. And I'm also reminded of the kind of, it seems that he's like giving, I think he wants to give like philosophy an alternative method, as opposed to the intellect, which scientific reasoning is going to use. And so intuition can kind of serve for philosophy in this disinterested way of, getting to these quote unquote general laws, that, and then further down on 177, he talks about how these can kind of supplement the intellectual categories or intellectual molds we have, like recognizing which ones are applicable, which ones are not. I think intuition serves as a way for him to kind of like recognize false problems and like touch back base with our direct experience as a way of, kind of maybe revisiting or reconsidering the problems, the pseudo problems that are arising from intellectual scientific general laws. That's how I'm tempted to read it. I still, and so like as like a philosophical method, I did just read the Bergsonism Deleuze first chapter, where he goes into intuition as philosophical method, as a rigorous method. So that's maybe feeding into my interpretation. But I was kind of just drawn to those parts where he somewhat distinguishes instinct from intuition and wondering how that's going to play out. On 178, he says something about it's from intelligence that has come the push that has made it rise to the point it has reached, talking about how like it's only intelligence that has allowed instinct to kind of rise to this idea of intuition. There was another thing I wanted to just throw out for consideration. Oh yeah, on 182, just like 4 or 5 lines down, he says, on the side of intuition, consciousness found itself so restricted by its envelope that intuition had to shrink into instinct. So again, just that wondering what's the difference between intuition and instinct. That's where he's talking about this kind of like, should we just like hands down prefer intuition over intellect? But then it says intelligence seems to there have like a key part to play in allowing intuition not to just fall into instinct.
I can't help but think of the first Borges story that we read, and I apologize for the people who aren't reading Borges, but about how, Nevitt asked this question of whether or not the sympathy is figurative or real. And, my first inclination is to ask, what is the difference between those two things? If we can believe that this figurative sympathy is real, then what is stopping it from becoming real? And from us to really kind of have a genuine sympathy with each other, if we all were to believe that our intuitions are right and real and correct, even if there's no reason for us to believe it. It's sort of like a faith, I think, that he's arguing and going for, possibly just for, the methodology of it and considering it and separating it from kind of previous philosophies. But I also think there's definitely a certain value in just believing in it and seeing kind of where that could take us.
My first reaction to that is to think that, since he wants to ground a lot of his ideas in empirical research. And so like his interpretation of instinct seems dependent on, you know, kind of like Sean was saying, that there's things that science can't explain, and this notion of instinct can explain those. And there he's talking about particular empirical facts, like, you know, the way these insects work and so on. So that makes me think he wants intuition to be something real, and that's important. On the other hand, Travis's comment makes me think that it could also be viewed as a heuristic, in that if you assume, I don't know if that's the right word, if you take, you know, if you take the principle of intuition as a philosophical principle as a heuristic, and, you know, that word always confuses me, but heuristic comes from this Greek, comes from the same Greek word as eureka, which is I found it. And so a heuristic is something that you use to sort of guide your search and sort of guide your interpretation. And so if you posited this intuition as a kind of heuristic, it might allow you to develop explanations of things that might not be otherwise explicable. And so, yeah, so that's kind of my thought. Yeah, maybe he wants it to be an empirical thing, but then on the other hand, maybe it would have value as a heuristic, a tool, even if we're not sure whether it's metaphysically real or not.
Yeah, I think he would love to be able to argue and have kind of all this empirical evidence to point at intuition. But I think he only has the empirical evidence to point towards instinct and intelligence. And then the space between that, which there is a space, you know, empirically there is this kind of thing that he can't necessarily grasp at, that he has to kind of go in this figurative explanation of it. So I think that, yeah, my question is, just because we can only talk about it figuratively, does that mean it's figurative?
Yeah, one of the problems here is the same as the problem with a lot of, like, you know, Merleau-Ponty ran into the same sort of problem. There's things that he thinks are real that are not articulable in language. And so, you know, here we are talking about things that aren't articulable in language, like intuition.
One thing that I find myself thinking a lot while reading this, and I don't know if this is that helpful to understanding, so I apologize, because it's kind of just me going off on, basically, somebody can tell me to shut up if they want. But I think that Bergson really assumes that intelligence is just the critical human capacity, like the thing that makes us distinct from animals, the explanation of how it is that we think. And then he describes it as having these very specific qualities, like having this very mechanistic outlook, right, needing to necessarily reduce things down to like right, what is it, unorganized objects. And I'm really not convinced that that's true. Like he really thinks that, you know, human beings are characterized with this obsession with unorganized objects. Everything that I've read in terms of thinkers like Feyerabend, in terms of like questions of epistemic anarchism and how exactly we're going to conceptualize the science, everything that I've read in terms of anthropologists talking about how other kinds of human societies operate, or even in terms of a lot of the animals that we would be talking about for this context. So if we're going to talk about like birds, or, I mean, it's mostly, you know, pointing to insects as the opposite here, which is a little bit more difficult to grok with, because they're just so biologically different from us that like using that as the point of comparison is in a lot of ways like very confusing. But I just don't know if it's really true that human beings naturally want to disassemble things in order to understand them, or whether that's just a product of the specific kinds of cultures, scientific expectations, and conceptions of what it means to do scientific analysis that we're coming from. And either way, that still makes Bergson's recognitions useful. Like if the problem is just like, Western scientific standards, want to disassemble everything, but the implication there is that like there are more naturally human ways of thinking about things that aren't reductive, in the way that Bergson thinks human intelligence has to necessarily be reductive. And I find this like very, very confusing in terms of how I want to address Bergson and how I'm like trying to interpret him, because he really seems to think that we just can't help but think about things in a method that disassembles them. And I guess a thing that like maybe Hunter would want to talk about here with respect to, I think that more dialectical methods of thinking, right, stuff like something that Hegel or Marx might present us with, are going to talk about the world in a much more fluid, dynamic, living way. And I think there's some amount of reason to think that human beings like are kind of more intrinsically dialectical in the way that they think. Like, yes, it's helpful to have formal training in how to do dialectics, but a lot of the reason why we find dialectics unintuitive is because we're kind of trained to have this much more concrete scientific outlook. But a lot of children will understand dialectics pretty well if you just present it to them immediately. Like it'll make intuitive sense to them. Anyway, sorry I blathered on for a bit there. I'd be curious to have input on that. Do y'all have ideas on why exactly it is Bergson thinks we intelligence is this specific thing? Sorry.
Maybe I don't have a full answer for you, but I was when you were talking reminded of this sentence that I did find interesting, and I feel like he doesn't really touch on it much. For the most part, I think what you're saying is the sense I get from the intellect. But there's this one sentence on 162, 163. It's the sentence that goes from those 2 pages. But he says something along the lines of, he says, there's just 2 conditions that can hardly be reconciled in the field in which our industry and consequently our intellect is engaged. I don't know why I was like wanting to read that sentence of him saying that like the intellect is consequently kind of like taken over by that he's talking about science in this previous paragraph. And I'm wondering, like, can anything be said there about, maybe perhaps the intellect isn't necessarily that way, but that the fact that it's just been kind of monopolized by the scientific project, that's where it's come to, how it's come out.
I definitely see it as a social problem. I think that we kind of have a natural inclination towards, existing in spaces that are not necessarily completely understood. And I think that, and this might be my own personal biases coming out a little more, but I just think that science kind of took this thing that brought us above animals, and then, which is intellect, and then thought that was the thing that we need to use, and that we all kind of have intuition, we all have instincts, we have all these feelings, but because we can't wrap our minds around it intellectually, or we can't, empirically kind of figure it out, we're inclined to dismiss it, I think. And I don't think that, I think that children, for example, exist in that world and are way more comfortable with it and are kind of forced over time to detach from their emotions and detach from their intuitions in hopes that they can kind of function and find their role or something like that. And I think that the kind of space that Bergson is talking about is way less clear. And when you have a lot of people, I think, interacting with each other, it creates a lot of problems, because sometimes those intuitions and those feelings are things that kind of break down these structures and walls that we create to kind of protect ourselves and ensure that we have meaning. I think. But, I don't know. It's always.
I wonder if, I think it's a really good question Sean brings up. And to what degree is this culturally relative? I wonder if Bergson might respond by saying that perhaps Western culture, and especially Western scientific culture, really took that intellect and ran with it, and that maybe some other cultures have retained more of a connection to intuition. So maybe he would stick with this characterization that these are the two, primary modes of, I don't know what, epistemological powers or something, but that Western culture has, emphasized one to an extreme to where it's sort of eclipsed, kind of like Travis was saying, it sort of eclipsed the other, to where we're on, we just don't have much of a sense of what that's like. Whereas maybe there's other cultures that have retained more of that. So here this is really wild speculation because I don't know much about anthropology, but for example, I've heard about the what's the politically correct term for Aboriginal? The First Nations in Australia, for example, and the whole dream time thing, and that they have this sort of dream time. And I don't really know if this is what's going on, but I wonder if that sort of consciousness, if maybe, maybe a Bergsonian anthropologist could go look at that and spend time there and find that maybe that is that sort of way of thinking about the world is a manifestation of intuition being more developed than it is in the West. So he could retain that distinction and just say it's, that we have these cultural differences along some continuum of emphasizing one or the other, perhaps. But that's speculation on my part.
I'm also, again, just drawn to lean back on his idea of tendencies and to think that, the intellect maybe has multiple tendencies, but this is the one that's been like emphasized and selected. That we still have. I feel like I was trying to look for one section in here that I thought he had referred to where he differentiated the mind from intellect, which just to me like highlighted the idea that our mind isn't restricted to this intellectual tendency as the way he's using it, which is to say that I think that it can just be something that we've selected for as a culture.
I think that one thing that I've been thinking, which I don't know if I necessarily believe in this, or if potentially Sean has a counterpoint that could kind of pull the rug out from under this sort of idea. But I feel like, and this is a feeling from reading Bergson, that yes, there is this sort of cultural force that embeds our thought into a certain mode of intellectualizing or intellectualism or whatever. But I think that he's attempting to be very explicit about something. Like let's say that they're like two Western and Eastern culture. Let's say Westerners are very into the intellectual, and Eastern thought or non-Western thought. There's some sects of non-Western thought that are much more intuitive, much more focused on intuition. I think that, and I might be wrong, seriously, but I think that Bergson would say, yes, they may be more in tune with intuition, and they may go about their lives in a much more intuitive way, and they may employ intuition much more regularly, or fall back on intuition in many more cases than we would, or would be more open to what intuition can reveal than we would. We would be quicker to dismiss intuition as irrationality, while the other people may. But I think that at the same time, he would still say, like, at zero level, at the base of the intellect, there is this inability for us to make explicit, make totally explicit in the realm of symbolic logic within which we live and within which our intellect operates and upon which our intellect was kind of designed and oriented. I feel like he would still say, yeah, you can be intuitive, but all your intuition is going to give you a vague feeling. And he says that phrase once or twice, which really kind of threw me for a loop later. I was like, what does he mean by a vague feeling? Which I guess was Nevitt, that was kind of your initial, part of your confusion about what intuition is and where he's going later on. He's probably going to get into it later. But I feel like he would say, like, yes, there are probably Eastern philosophies that are relatively in tune with intuition, but that those intuitive epistemologies are still unable to make totally explicit the continuum of anything. You know what I mean? To totally rationalize a continuous thing. Because you can't do that. That's what he's arguing. He's arguing you're not supposed to try to rationalize a continuous thing because you just can't. But we try to, and that's why we see like time as this timeline, and we compartmentalize things. But I think that his one of his points that there is like a baseline sort of antagonism between totally explicit intellect and this intuitive. I know you guys probably don't care about David Lynch at all, but David Lynch once called intuition. He makes these videos, these silly videos on his YouTube. Like, what is?
I care about David Lynch. I just want to say that.
Yeah.
Well, and I do too. I like David Lynch.
Yeah, well, he has this video on YouTube where he's talking about a checking stick. He makes this stupid little stick that he points at his art and he says, I can point this at this art and I get a feeling. And then he says, and then I put it on my head and I get a thinking. And he says, now you don't need one of these, luckily, because human beings have this thing called intuition, which is a thinking feeling, and I get, maybe that's kind of clogging up my brain from real academia, but I feel like that is what it is. It's a thinking feeling. It's a feeling, and maybe these Eastern philosophies or epistemologies are much more in tune with their feelings and trust their feelings, but that doesn't allow for a rigid sort of doctrine to be built out of a set of feelings that could be constant and universal and able to be placed into an industrious mode. You know what I mean? To be industrial with it, like he says that our intellect came from, is being industrious. But maybe I'm wrong.
So I would say I largely agree with your analysis. I guess what I'm trying to point to here, that I think is important, and I think these are the things that either like sort of Bergson is missing or are at the very least like complications that are worth keeping in mind. So one thing, just to we could like kind of present this as an Eastern-Western like debate or like a something like that. If you read Feyerabend, I can never say his name right. Epistemic Anarchism. I forget in which bit this is. It's been a while. I want to say it's like his book on nature and natural science, but anyways, he thinks that a very good example of a non sort of, I guess what we might call scientific or a non-reductionistic or what Bergson would call, I guess, like intellectual mode of analysis is actually Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. And he thinks that those books, right, they impart a worldview that is less reductionistic, less intellectual in character. So there would be like significant people think that these are very important books, right, in terms of shaping our culture, shaping the way that we think about the world, shaping the evolution of Western society. And Feyerabend thinks that these are examples of a radically different method of approaching inquiry about the world, about how we relate to it, about how we interact with it. So we don't need to go to like East Asia, right? We don't need to go to China, or we don't need to go to the New World. Like we can find examples of this within a Western context that are still relevant today. This isn't like, oh well, in ancient Gaul, people believe blah blah. No, like people still read these books. What was I just saw a? I'll look at it later. The other thing that I would say is that I guess what I'm kind of resisting from Bergson is he seems to think that we should understand intelligence as the thing that is the thing that the human evolution has necessarily been acting upon in order to make us into the type of entities that we are. And this seems to imply, first of all, that it would be really hard for us to move away from intellectuality, just like as a species. And I don't know if I buy either of those two bits. Like I would say, for instance, the capacity for social storytelling, which seems to have this much more evolutionary aspect to it, is just as much or more important to human evolution as our intellectual ability to build tools is. Right, our existence as a social species is a critical element of that. And while he does, and I remember in the earlier sections he made a big point about how language fits into this, he also seems to think that language is an intrinsically kind of like discrete, breaking up into bits, right, sort of reductionistic type mechanism. And I don't think language has to be in order to operate. So I guess the big points that that I'm sort of hitting on, he's thinking that insects are this extreme example of the sort of perfection of instinct, and then human beings are this extreme example of the perfection of the intellect. I think, I'm not going to try and speculate or comment onto the nature of insects, because again, I just find that like as an example to explore, like some of the most alien experiencing things on this world that I can imagine would be insects. But it doesn't seem to me that intelligence has played like such an overwhelmingly critical role in human development, human evolution, in terms of like what human beings are good at, which means that I think that the distance between the distance that we would need to travel to a way of approaching the world that's less intellectual, more intuitive is I guess less than he's suggesting. The other thing that I would say is in terms of your analysis that like we're not going to be able to come up with a rational like a rationalized explanation of these intuitions. I totally agree with that. If we could do that, then right, there wouldn't be a lot of a point to making this distinction, which I agree. I guess I agree more or less that these categories that Bergson has presented are like correct. I think that, yeah, okay, so instinct and intelligence, I actually actively like the idea of conceptualizing those as two different extremifications of something that might be more or less present in certain individuals or in different organisms.
Yeah, I think of it as kind of like the same thing he was talking about with sleeping. Like we have a sort of sleeping instinct, and so they're like, to some extent, some people focus on more intelligence, some people focus more on instinct. But I think like philosophy, I think he would argue philosophy has gone too far in the realm of intelligence.
Sure, and I would definitely like say that I'm gonna bitch about analytic philosophy here and be like, yeah, they just want to rationalize everything. And I certainly agree that like an attempt to present a sort of rational, quantitative, sort of like scientific quote unquote explanation of something that has these like intuitive and instinctual components, it's just not going to know what to do with those. But I think that like humans are capable of developing metaphysical systems and like philosophical accounts that aren't so tied to a rigorous intellectual analysis, if that makes sense. So that would be fun.
I'm also reminded of the point where he does talk about like making all these clear distinctions and thinking about them, talking about them in extremes just for the sake of discussion. And then he says after that about like, but we can undo all of this afterwards. Yeah.
So Sean, what I'm thinking is, in a general sense, I'm thinking of it in a general sense of the way, at least the way I think about it, the way the intellect carves the world up into things, being a manifestation of that tendency that Bergson's talking about. So, this is a theme we hit upon a whole lot in a lot of different seminars. But, like Nietzsche saying, there are no things, there's just this continuum of varying densities, but then the rational mind has to carve the world up into particular kinds of things in order to do what it needs to do. And so, like in that essay, Truth and Lies, Nietzsche says there is no such thing as a leaf. Really, there are just these things. And then what the mind does is it abstracts away all the differences between certain of those things and comes up with the concept leaf. And now we can talk about leaves, but the leaf is not, it's an abstraction. And so in order for humans to function the way we function, like Bergson talks about tools, for example, natural tools that instinct uses are things like sticks and blades of grass and stuff like that. But human beings, what we do is we take matter that it doesn't have any natural function, and we force it to obey our wills by constructing tools that are specialized. And so I think he does focus a lot on this sort of hyper rationalization that you get, for example, in analytic philosophy or in mathematical physics, when we reduce everything to a mathematical formula. But he seems to think of the intellect in this really general sense of the human ability to conceptualize things, to reduce the world to concepts, and make things appear to us. To use sort of a Heideggerian way of thinking about it, we make things appear to us in the world through concepts, through rationalization, through carving the world up into things that we can recognize. And that at least seems to be a pretty universal property of human species.
Can you guys hear me? Okay, so one thing I was thinking about is when he talks about the intellect, especially in that really kind of sort of extreme way, he's talking about as a generalization. So he's making those dichotomies essentially in principle as kind of somewhat abstractions, but abstractions according to their own kind of natural lines of articulation, kind of like what he referred to with Plato's dialectic, that the way that the intellect kind of carves things up, if it did it in a way that was actually not interested in practical action and whatnot, if it did it according to trying to actually reflect reality in some sense, that it would do it according to these lines of articulation that are natural to something that is really a mix and a multiplicity. And there he gets this notion, of intellect versus instinct, but they're not actually these distinct categories that are separate from each other. So I think that's why, we can, when we think of the intellect as something that's, the way he's talking about it is in the most generalized, almost like extreme version of it. So I think we have to, tendencies. Yeah, they're basically tendencies of divergent direction, but really they're part of the same thing, and they constantly interpenetrate each other. So I think he would say, in fact, in contrast to in principle, that in fact they're not quite as extreme as, you know, the kind of hyper rationalization or hyper intellectualization that he kind of talks about. In a way, he's kind of trying to distinguish between these two different divergent tendencies, ultimately to kind of have a better focus on what that sort of multiplicity, that mix of the total, you know, vital impulse of life is. So that's why it kind of seems, I think, probably more extreme than he's really trying to say, I guess. Hopefully that actually applied, because I can't hear anything until basically just now. So hopefully that was relevant.
I would say it was relevant.
That's good.
So, you know, this is maybe, again, a question that he's going to answer later. What Chase said made me wonder if he's thinking that maybe a reliance on intuition might give the intellect a more, I don't know what, a natural way of carving the world up. So I think, you know, I think Hunter's right, got to be right that that whatever epistemological deliverances you get from intuition is something that could not be articulable kind of by definition, but maybe he would say as a methodological principle, having developing intuition more fully might allow the intellect to at least come up with a false abstraction that somehow represents things closer than what, you know, because I get the impression I get from his discussion of the intellect in general is that what tended to happen is, you know, as Chase said, it was initially evolved for the purpose of action, but then because of the way it freed the mind up, it just kind of went to seed. It just kind of went crazy. And, you know, hey, look, I can divorce, you know, this intellect can be divorced from reality. I think there are forms that exist outside of material, you know, and so on. But maybe there's a way to keep the intellect closer to intuition somehow. But again, that may be something he talks about later. So since nobody's talking, I'll talk more. Way back when I was talking about intellect, and I'm looking through the chat, instinct and intuition, Joey read this passage that, and then emphasized that intellect is more general than instinct. And so that seems to me that's probably really important. So that's one thing. I think that example I had with the insect is kind of misleading because, you know, the instinct, if the instinct is really particular, like the instinct of this bug is like directed at this other bug and on doing particular things. Whereas apparently, you know, from that passage Joey read, intuition is broader in some sense. I don't really know what that means.
You all were talking so much about other philosophers, and which is, I mean, I don't want to pretend I understood every single thing you said, but in a sense, structurally I understood the progression of what you were talking about. But if you'll permit me, yeah, I've never heard of Feyerabend. I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, but I looked him up, and surprise, he was a Nazi. And then Heidegger gave a interview to Der Spiegel in 1967, which the only stipulation was Der Spiegel could not print that interview until Heidegger was dead. And in that 1967 interview, Heidegger referred to, I'm paraphrasing, but I'm pretty close, the essential truth of National Socialism. And I don't want to use the word bracket, because with Husserl that has very specific meaning, but I too have concerns about scientism and the over-reliance of science in Western culture, almost the suppression of feeling and rejection of other types of knowing that are extraordinarily old in human culture. But I would just express a hope that you all could find philosophers not tainted by National Socialism when it comes to the critique of science and over intellectualization or over conceptualization and things like that, because I do think there are connections in ideas. Thank you very much for letting me speak.
Yeah, can I respond to that real quick? So, Feyerabend was 14 when the Nazis anschlused Austria. He was drafted into the army basically at gunpoint. I think describing him as a Nazi is questionable at best. He pretty much throughout most of his life expressed pretty clearly anarchist views. Right, I mean, this is a complicated question. I don't know, should he have run off into the wilderness instead of serving in the military? But I think describing him as a Nazi is certainly like an oversimplification of a complicated question.
What about Heidegger? He wasn't 14
Yeah, so we've got to
in
be
the
real,
1930s. He was a grown-ass man.
we've got to be really careful not to commit the ad hominem fallacy here. I mean, the fact that Heidegger was a Nazi does not follow that Heidegger's philosophy is wrong or unworthy of inspection. There are people who claim, you can find books who claim that that Nazism is implicit in some of his thought. I have not read those books, but just, someone's political views do not necessarily, it does not necessarily corrupt their metaphysical views, for example. So, it'd be like saying, for example, the Nazis did a lot of work. They wrote a lot of physiology textbooks, and they did a lot of amazing work on human physiology. And the method that they used was vivisection. So they were cutting apart live humans, and that was one reason why they were able to get such excellent sketches, for example, in their anatomy books. And so there was an ethical question for the medical community after that: do we use this material? So there's a good question: do we use that material? But that doesn't mean the material is somehow invalid or corrupted or inaccurate. And so I think we got to be really careful not to fall to the ad hominem fallacy here.
But I think that's a different issue. I mean, the Nazis also put people in freezing water and then took them out, and they actually measured the number of minutes they were in that water to see if they wouldn't die of hypothermia. And there was a debate over, should the medical community use that data? That's a completely different question. From the little I've read of Heidegger's philosophy, I don't think he would say that it was accidental, that he believed that he thought National Socialism reflected an essential truth from his own philosophy. And I mean, I do agree with you. I mean, Hitler's a vegetarian. That doesn't mean all vegetarians are Nazis. Yeah, of course not. But it seems to me that what I'm talking about, and remember, he's Heidegger. I mean, for God's sake, he's a giant of the 20th century. But it seems to me that from Heidegger's, and I apologize, but my sense is that he would not say that there was an accidental connection between his philosophy and his embracing or acceptance or his acknowledging from his point of view of certain truths of National Socialism.
If that's the case, Ed, in order for me not to mention Heidegger, you need to provide me with actual evidence of that connection.
Sure.
And
Sure. Oh no, please understand. I apologize. I'm not saying don't. Begging your pardon. I'm not. I'm in no. I wasn't saying don't bring up these other philosophers at all. But what I was just saying is they have some baggage that we really haven't discussed.
Sure, but Heidegger heavily influenced Sartre, Merleau-Ponty, and numerous 20th and 21st century philosophers. So if you want to extract everything of Heidegger from Western philosophy, you're going to rip the entire tradition to shreds from Heidegger on. And so there are features of Heidegger's philosophy that, at least to me, seem very compelling. And I'm going to continue to talk about those, and I'm going to continue to use those in my analyses. And if you or someone else wants to present hard evidence that those ideas are somehow inextricably entwined with particular Nazi doctrines, then I will reconsider them. But other than that, I'm not going to apologize for bringing those in.
Oh no, and I'm not asking anybody to do that. I guess my position is somewhere in between inextricably intertwined to being completely separable. And I think there's a huge range of middle there that is worth investigating.
So when it comes to Heidegger, I think definitely he was basically a Nazi. I think that's not really up for debate. But yeah, it really comes down to the question of basically, is his philosophy inherently fascist, or to what degree or what part of it would be? So I think you could probably make a case that a few things, especially in retrospect, sort of are, but then Heidegger's philosophy is, of course, so abstract that it's kind of hard to determine that. I think some of the things he says about historicity and the necessity to be kind of grounded in your history and your culture, in contrast to being alienated from your culture. This is after you've already essentially authenticated yourself and your possibilities and blah, 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 all that Heidegger jargon, that you could probably make a case that he saw that his historicity as basically 1930s Germany, and he fell in a sense to actually his own sort of inauthenticity by following the crowd. And one thing I think is interesting is you can basically use Heidegger's philosophy to show how the Nazis basically failed in terms that Heidegger saw them probably as more savior figures, I guess essentially in the 30s against modernity and Western technology and all these things that, yeah, I think a lot of us wouldn't agree, another can understand that was it's disturbing now and was probably disturbing then, but he had this false solution. But if you read his stuff about the question concerning technology, it sounds like, especially in retrospect of what the Nazis did, you could use it as a very good critique of that kind of thinking that the Nazis basically put into practice, of treating everything as something to be, measured, quantified, to be used as resources, this kind of calculatable rationalism that everything has to be reduced to this one mode of analysis. I think a large degree of that Heidegger's philosophy can be used to critique that. So another thing I would say, just the last thing, would be that, a lot of philosophers, previous, generations, decades, centuries, there's the kind of the question of, authorial intent and whatnot. And I think in this regard, we don't necessarily have to be a slave to, this kind of recreation or what we believe would be, the intent of the person who made that philosophy. I think personally what's more interesting for me is, what can we do with these ideas? And if I can use Heidegger's ideas to critique fascism, then I think that's very worthy of engaging with. And it also brings some kind of a slight redemptive irony, I guess, about it. So, yeah.
So I think there are a lot of things I'm thinking about. Everybody has made at least one compelling point in the last 5 minutes. Great jobs all around. Like I've been going, oh, that's pretty good. That makes sense. Oh, well, I mean, But I think basically, I really like. I'll point to two thinkers. Well, first off, to give credit to in some sense to the argument that there is a chance that certain, there's a difference between an ad hominem and a real there's a difference between an ad hominem and a real problem. Like if somebody says, oh, I witnessed the murder with my own 2 eyes, and you notice that they have a walking stick and dark sunglasses, and they had a lead dog that led them into the courtroom. It's like, okay, I'm sorry, sir, but you're blind. I don't mean to attack your character, but there's no way that you saw that. So there are certain instances where it's like it could be like, oh yeah, maybe Heidegger really did have some inclination toward. But I really two philosophers that come to mind. First off, Louis Althusser. Louis Althusser's I really like. I haven't read any of his full books, but I've read excerpts and essays, especially when I was doing some stuff for a paper a couple semesters ago. But Louis Althusser was a brilliant critic of ideology, but at the end of his life, he strangulated his wife to death in bed, and then was committed to an insane asylum. And so there is reason to believe that man was insane, and the things that he was saying were insane. And that's where I would point to what Chase is saying, that like, even if perhaps there was some, let's go to the end. Let's assume that he was crazy. Let's assume that he was totally off his rocker. The things that he wrote, even if they came from the ravings of a madman, to me right now, they form this ground from which I can work, from which I can develop ideas, from which I can take lessons from history, and I can decide, oh, well, maybe I should do this or I shouldn't do that. I would listen to anybody that has an interesting perspective on their experience, you know what I mean? But even if it's the ravings of a madman, there's something to be learned or gained. It shouldn't be burned in the pile, so to speak. But another something, if we can get a little particular about the Heideggerian sort of process, which I think is like, I guess underneath a lot of this sort of, was he, wasn't he, or I guess he definitely was, but what part of it did he mean it, and what part was he kind of like letting go? I would point to his, let's call him a successor or an heir to Heidegger's lineage of thought. Jean-Paul Sartre was a major proponent of the USSR. He was a hardcore fan of the Soviet Union. And he got into massive debates with Albert Camus and other members of the Parisian intellectual community over his very fervent or whatever attachment to these ideas. Now, how can Jean-Paul Sartre, taking with such a thorough reading of Heidegger that he did, and with such a thorough intake of Heidegger's ideas into his own ideas, right? Such a full integration. How is it that Jean-Paul Sartre, instead of saying, oh, we should become Nazis, rather we should become hardcore Stalinists? Actually, that's what Heidegger really meant in a way, is that we should become this totally other end. I think that the confusion, the problem, right, is that it's like Chase said, the ideas that Heidegger put forth and the ideas that Sartre put forth and these phenomenological arguments and I guess philosophical arguments and metaphysical arguments, they do not have at face value, none of them have inherent Nazistic ideas attached to them or Soviet ideas, stapled to them. It's not inherent within the idea. Now, you can see a very easy train of reasoning from historicity of Heidegger to this attachment to authenticity and the Übermenschen, das Mann, and being an authentic German or whatever, you know what I mean? Searching for authenticity in the form of being an authentic to your people. That's a very easy jump to make. I agree. And it's kind of hard to divorce that material from the conclusion that you need to attach yourself to a nation and a culture and whatever. I can agree. But at the same time, it's these ideas, I think the thing that's happening, I think that, and also Nevitt, I agree that he was insane and therefore all of his writing would be, that's like the genetic fallacy. Like, he has one problem and therefore everything he did is thrown out. I agree with you, Nevitt, that like calling Louis Althusser all of his writing insane because he was insane at the end of his life or even throughout all of it. I agree, it's an ad hominem fallacy, and that's something we have to avoid. But I think that I don't want to critique these individuals on the basis of their proclivity towards their people or towards a foreign people whom they find more sympathy with or towards a workers' movement or towards an authoritarian movement or whatever. I think that this is my problem or my focus here is the openness of the ideas to those sorts of ideas. What was it about Heidegger's ideas that allowed it to become this thing, to be used in this way? What was it about Heidegger's ideas that not only allowed it to be used in the favor of hardcore German nationalism, to then also be transmogrified into this hardcore Marxism-Leninism? What is this? What are these basic presuppositions that both of these radical extremes are agreeing on? Those presuppositions are Heidegger's arguments. That's what I'm arguing, is that it's at its base. It's like a stem cell. You know what I mean? And I think that Heidegger was a Nazi, but a brilliant Nazi, and he used his brilliance to further Nazism in the instances that I've come into contact with, at least in a couple instances where I've encountered historical or hermeneutical studies of Heidegger's work with the Nazi Party and his relationship to Hannah Arendt and yada, yada, yada. I think that it's not, Heidegger is a Nazi, and so we need to avoid his ideas because they might lead us into Nazism. I think that we need to, because they are dangerous, because they can lead to Nazism, I think that's why it is so much more important to sink our teeth in, to totally say, okay, what if he was a Nazi? Why do people like him? Why are we still talking about the guy? Even if he was a Nazi, there's this degree to which the work has value in an academic context that is not up for debate as to whether, the usage of it and its ethicality, that's up for debate. But the importance and the impact and the ripples that it made through history and the effects that we're feeling right now, that's not up for debate. And that, even if it was started by a Nazi, deserves investigation and understanding. And I think that with specifically, particularly within the case of Heidegger and Sartre and all them, there is a base from which metaphysical arguments of this existential and phenomenological nature can be applied in favor of a power structure. And be that power structure a Nazi power structure or a Soviet power structure or whatever, there is a danger that kind of lies within them. But that's the risk. That's the risky part of engaging with these ideas. That's the value in engaging with these ideas. You know what I mean? The very danger that pushes us away and says, oh, maybe we should avoid that, is the reason that it is so very important to dig to the deepest bedrock of these ideas and see, okay, what can we use from what has been said before to make a good society now, or a good idea now, or something like that, which I guess is I just belabored Nevitt's point, really. But I for some reason, I felt like that clarity it mattered to me before I said it, and it still matters a little bit. But I really feel is important here, that their ideas can be put towards Nazism, but Hannah Arendt can read these ideas and feel love and passion in her heart for this poor, gentle man that she loves so much. You know what I mean? It's this openness to the influence of ideological movements. Do you see what I'm saying? And I think that applies to it, like Plato and Aristotle, even. Like, Aristotle's seen as so much more liberal than Plato, because Plato was this totalitarian aristocrat person, but then Aristotle was saying that a slave is a tool of the mind, and a woman is to be without, and all this. There are a lot of problems with a lot of the things that a lot of these people said, but it's not up to us to say that they are a good source or a bad source, or that there is inherent fascism within the entire breadth of not only an individual's work, but also the work which that individual's work influenced. You see, those are two wildly different claims. It's very, and so we need to stick to like what we can say, rather than like, I guess, what we kind of want to say to lead a charge. I don't know. I'm losing myself.
Nietzsche said that there are dangerous ideas, kind of to echo Hunter's comment, and that one of the, artists in general and philosophers in particular are masochists, because we look at ideas that make us squirm and we find uncomfortable, and we're willing to sit there and stare at them and think about them. And that if an idea is dangerous, that doesn't necessarily mean it's wrong. Kind of to echo some of the things Hunter said. And, for example, Nietzsche thought the idea that God is dead is a horrific and dangerous idea. He was desperately afraid of, at least on my reading, that when that idea really trickled through Western society, that it would produce widespread nihilism and the collapse of values in general. And I think to a significant degree, his prophecy has come true. And so, but his idea is that, that God has ceased to become a regulative notion in Western society. And so it's just a matter of time when that translates into a sort of value nihilism. If that's right, it could be that the consequences of that observation have been difficult to deal with. But, for example, existentialism is, at least one strain of existentialism is exactly an effort to deal with that exact problem. That when you've lost any sort of transcendent ground for values, then values seem to be, groundless and pointless and meaningless. So my point is, even, that if, it may be that Heidegger said things that may have opened the way to Nazism. I don't know. I mean, I haven't looked at that question carefully. But even if he did, that doesn't necessarily mean those ideas are wrong. So, for example, Nietzsche said things that that the Nazis appropriated as well. Now, obviously, some of those were a flat misappropriation. But if you look at some of the stuff Nietzsche said, he preferred, for example, aristocratic government over democratic government, as did Plato, and for pretty much the same reasons, as far as I can tell. So Nietzsche was no fan of democracy. Plato was no fan of democracy. And so does that mean that we should then throw out those ideas, and not look at them? Well, some of the things, like one of the reasons Plato did not like a democracy is because he viewed democracy as by the uneducated rabble. And when you have uneducated rabble making political decisions, they do stupid things like kill Socrates. Well, you could look at our society today, and I would argue that our, and Ed's more qualified to say this than me, but that our founding fathers did not want a pure democracy. They wanted an elective aristocracy because they understood some of the same problems that Plato understood, that if you had the uneducated masses making political decisions, you're going to have, chaos. And then you could say that maybe that's exactly what's happened today, is that the masses of people are now no longer well educated. And so we're making stupid decisions. But if, that observation does not, it may be a dangerous observation. That doesn't mean it's false, though.
Can I just say, it is kind of amusing to me because the two examples that we've gone to here are what Sartre and his love for the USSR, which a lot of people would say that the Nazism of Nazi Germany and the Stalinism of the USSR are basically the left wing and right wing versions of fascism. I don't agree with that statement, but that seems to be like a common ideological position on those two things. So you could probably, right, if that's true, then you could probably make an argument that, oh, well, that makes sense. Okay, so Heidegger has a right-wing interpretation of totalitarianism and fascism, and then Sartre just has a left-wing interpretation of that. So, maybe phenomenology and Heideggerianism just leads you to totalitarianism and fascism, effectively. And then we're using the example of Nietzsche, right? I'm not saying that the things that y'all are saying are wrong, but certainly these are some of the most controversial examples we could have gone with, because Nietzsche is regularly interpreted as a right winger. You have this complicated intellectual attempt to build up what gets called in the scholarly circles as left Nietzsche by figures like Derrida and Deleuze. And which is, I think, I find that a worthy effort, but certainly I've read a lot of stuff recently basically critiquing the idea that left Nietzsche is at all a plausible interpretation of Nietzsche, and that this intellectual attempt to extract from him kind of ideas compatible with a left-wing view of the world was like a fool's errand from the beginning. And it's why, for instance, someone I don't think this is the reason he would specifically give, but I've seen this used as kind of an example case, why someone like Zizek would view Deleuze as not an authentic leftist, because his ideas are sort of peppered in with this aristocratic and Nietzschean thought that is essentially unreformed because it's been extracted from him. So I like these examples, but they are pretty much literally the most controversial examples we could have gone with. The other thing that I wanted to say with respect to this is, so there's a specific reason why I like to bring in authors like Feyerabend, like Camus, right, who got mentioned, right, in terms of his critique of Sartre, sort of anarchist thought, and then right, hasn't come up with this reading, but people like Arendt, or even Deleuze to a certain extent, although I think he's much more controversially in this category, because I do think they actually offer plausible counter arguments to hegemonic views, right? The big thing that sort of Feyerabend wants to emphasize is this idea that there are multiple different modes of thinking that can plausibly constitute their own scientific analysis, and he goes all over the world to analyze this. He talks about Polynesians and the methods that they use in order to navigate. Right, he talks about South Americans and how it is that they grow corn, and he talked about the methods that they use to construct and convey knowledge. And what he argues is that all of these different methods are better at doing certain kinds of intellectual work, and because of that, any proper science would have to be multifaceted. It couldn't come from one specific cultural background. It couldn't come from, like, it couldn't be univocal in the way that a lot of Westerners tend to think about it. So I mean, I bring him in explicitly as a counter, or at least I would hope, some of these kind of overly Western, overly like plausibly like colonialist fascist ideas. You know, as you just bring in these authors who have like explicitly tried to think about that and have tried to like present countervailing ideas, I guess.
I think it was Arendt that wrote a fairly substantial study on the origins of totalitarianism, and she actually has 1/3 of her of the tripod of a base of it in colonialism, and she was the first person, in fact, the only serious person I've ever read who actually talked about that connection. So anyway, so when you mentioned Sean, her name and her, how she makes connections, it jumped out at me. And my intent in bringing up Heidegger was to have the conversation that we all had today. And so I appreciate the seriousness of everybody. And I'm glad you know that I'm not trying to be an intellectual dictator and say that we shall not talk about fill in the blank, but rather, you know, what are these very interesting relationships in terms of a body of ideas from any one of the philosophers. Thanks.
So one thing that I've been thinking of to kind of go back to Bergson, and also is, well, I don't want to get into it. Basically, I disagree with Sean over that Nietzsche like could not be utilized in some way other than aristocracy or whatnot. But I think as somewhat of an example of that, so in the book on kind of the bottom of, well, okay, so there's the bottom of 157 where he's talking about basically insect societies, and he basically talks about these instinctual societies that are very regimented because they are riveted by their structure and by the functions. And I thought that was really interesting because a lot of it sounded actually like a lot of forms of basically like human societal organization. I'm thinking especially of kind of like the caste system in India, but even Plato's Republic is very much like this. It even sees the, you know, his republic as analogous to a body that has different functions, and that people are, you know, naturally like this. They have different functions and whatnot. So I thought that was interesting in the sense that, you know, it seems like some societies are almost like more instinctual than intellectual in some ways, or even, and some may even be intuitive in other ways. Where, so Bergson has in his later writings, he had some interesting stuff to say about morality and society and whatnot that I think could be relevant. But for here, I think it's interesting that you have this kind of these different designations, I guess, of societies, and that they could still apply to human society. And I think we can get something from this, in that I see a lot of the things he talks about as, you know, pertaining to ants and wasps and whatnot, seem to pertain to humans a lot. And also in a similar fashion, you know, all the ways he talks about basically the intellect in such an extreme way, that also seems to apply to some societies more so than others also. So I think there's a lot of interesting places to go here in terms of how we can look at what he's talking about, is these different facets of life or whatnot. But how can we look at this and see, why are some societies kind of built on this old idea of these instinctual subdivisions and everything? And the other part that I found interesting in this regard is at the bottom of 161, he talks about how the intellect wants to transform matter into an instrument of action, into an organ, which he talks about the etymological sense, which is basically a function, a tool of that. And to go with the whole idea then of so what is an intellectual society then? An intellectual society still has this idea that it wants to see matter in terms of an organ, an instrument. And I think if you look at something like these instinctual societies, there's something pretty similar going on too, but also in the way that the intellect, it can only handle, dead, inert matter. Even living matter, it has to treat it like inert matter. I see something like that going on in society, especially, modern day contemporary Western society, or whatever you want to call it, that seems to be really dominated by this intellectual function. And basically, there's this problem of treating, living things as if they're dead, as if they're inert matter. And when there are things that can just be, managed and, put into data and algorithms and controlled that way. And this notion also of the organs, I think, is interesting because it kind of goes into how it looks at these things as, these kind of reified sedimentations of functions, and that there's a certain kind of managerial orchestrating intelligence to the intellect that looks at society the same way that it looks at matter. And this made me think of 1,000 Plateaus and about Deleuze's idea of the body without organs. So in a lot of ways that seems to not make any sense, but if you think about it, it's the body without these, rigid forms of organization of function. It's actually more something like an intuitive society, like an open society that has this variability, but is still at the same time kind of in tune with these flows and these movements of life. So I think you could look at something like 1,000 Plateaus or Deleuze's kind of social philosophy in general as very much Bergsonian. And I think here it's very interesting because you kind of see these, kind of continuity or resonance here with these different notions about, these aspects of life and whatnot. So that was quite a rant. So I'll just leave that there.
I don't know if this is a good example, and I hesitate to use it because of Sean's comments about just kind of jumping to non-Western philosophies as exemplifying intuition. Maybe that's not right, and maybe that's actually exhibiting some sort of cultural insensitivity or something. Nevertheless, I'll throw out this example. I don't know if this would fit with what Bergson's saying, but I had a Tai Chi teacher up until recently he was a Christian, and so he really, really steered away from the notion of Qi. And he interpreted Tai Chi exclusively in terms of body mechanics, which turned out to be a pretty effective way of teaching it. but he's recently dropped out because he has to leave and move out of town. And so he recommended a new teacher who we had practiced with a few times in Austin. And this guy is all about chi. It's all, you know, chi, chi, chi. And he, I've only been to 2 of his classes, but in one of them, you know, we were holding some position and he said, so can you feel the chi between your hands? And my response is, I feel something. I'm not really sure what it is. And then the next, he didn't say anything on that lesson, but the next day at another lesson, there was a whole bunch more people there, and he went kind of on a rant about how these mechanistic Western reductionist ideas are detrimental to a Tai Chi practice, and you really have to believe in Chi in order to do this correctly, blah, 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 blah. But, you know, maybe I'm feeling Chi, I don't know. I mean, I tend to want to be agnostic and say, I do seem to feel something. I don't know if it's chi. I don't know if it, as my son said, if it's some artifact of proprioception, you know, the way the body senses its own position in space. I don't know. But then I'm wondering, and, you know, part of it may be kind of like Travis was saying, you could think of chi as kind of a heuristic, or maybe I'm misinterpreting Travis, but, you know, I could think of chi as a heuristic. And so, you know, when I'm practicing, I could think of, at least imaginatively, imagine myself engaging with chi, and that might actually provide me certain benefits in practice that I might not be able to find if I just said, this is total bullshit. But I'm not sure it's necessary that I confess like a Taoist creed, I believe in the eternal chi. But anyway, I'm just wondering if, because, you know, chi is not something, you know, people have tried. I suspect it's not something that you could explain analytically according to a contemporary mechanistic physics. And that you couldn't probably analyze mathematically, but it might be something you can feel possibly. And I don't know if that's if that maybe intuition is something different than that. But there are these feelings that appear in the practice, you know, maybe, I don't know. I wonder.
Yeah, no, that is, I think, what I'm trying to say by it, honestly. It's just like, I think that with certain things, yeah, just going into it, kind of saying that, yeah, that it is chi, it is, and then just seeing kind of where that takes you and whether or not you feel it. I just feel like there's kind of like certain sayings like fake it till you make it and stuff like that. But I think that there is like a real ground for that on some level. I experience that a lot, of just kind of faking something and going through the motions until it really kind of makes sense in your head. And I think there's been a lot of personal experiences where I've had to do that and kind of convince myself, just to motivate myself in like school and stuff like that, that what I'm doing means something, even if I know kind of nothing means anything. And, you know, yeah. So it's just like, it's more of a personal practice than anything. And that's why I'm a little hesitant to kind of just bring it forth as like a really full-fledged idea or anything, but it's definitely something I've seen in my own experience.
Yeah, there's I can't remember his name, but he is a kind of a writer that writes about magical practices, kind of Western esoteric tradition, and he talks about the difference between basically the idea of a magical idea. He talks about as if idea, where you do it as if this is true and you see what happens. And it's very much a practical kind of thing. And I think something like Tai Chi, you know, basically esoteric Taoism, that's the same thing going on there as in a lot of these Western esoteric traditions, where they're also doing energy work and things like that. Does that mean this stuff exists, you know, like nuts and bolts like that? I don't think it's going to exist in the same way that physics would talk about energy, but that is kind of beside the point, because it's more geared towards, can you use these as an operative mode of conceiving something to kind of bring about certain results? And that's really what's at stake there. It's an as if idea. And so I think you were talking about this earlier, Travis. Was that, I think it was Travis who mentioned fabulation. I don't know, I couldn't hear like almost everything you guys were talking about earlier. Maybe it was Sean. Travis looks confused. So, but Bergson had this notion of fabulation within his different societies as ways of kind of essentially using the imagination to come up with ideas and applying them in all these different ways. And I think he was really, I think you could definitely see this in Nietzsche as well, where he talks about that. But it's interesting that Bergson had a very similar idea in terms of what someone could do with the imagination and apply it in a productive manner. Not that I think, you know, by saying something is imaginary, I don't think that means it's false or anything. In a way, it's kind of like a whole nother epistemological level, I guess. But yeah, I think these notions are interesting and apply also to intuition. Since I think a lot of what Bergson was trying to get at was something more kind of like that. It was, you know, not at this very determinate, you know, binary yes, no, does it exist in a, you know, in a objective physical reality sense. I think he would say that that is definitely, you know, a question for the intellect, where this intuition notion, it's inherently non-definable, and therefore it's going to, I think, at least in an analogous manner, it's going to be more like these kind of, you know, intuitive, almost spiritual practices that we're talking about. Yeah.
That reminds me again of that Nietzsche passage, Beyond Good and Evil 36. You know, he says the conscience of method requires that we make this experiment. And you know, that really, when you talk about as if, that's really what he seems to be proposing. Is it possible we could interpret the world as if it was a manifestation of will to power? Because it's not like something you could empirically verify, but it's an interesting metaphysical hypothesis that may allow you to interpret and explain things that were not otherwise explicable. And so, you know, yeah, so maybe Bergson is suggesting something like that, you know, because when I'm thinking about that Tai Chi practice, it does seem to have potentially real effects, in the sense that and I can do the as if thing. I just can't do the dogmatic, oh, there is this thing. But, you know, I can go with the kind of put myself in this middle space where I'm going to work as if this is going on. And what seems to happen is it cues me in certain movements that I don't know that I would otherwise get those cues. You know what I'm saying? I mean, it's kind of a vague thing, but if I imagine there's chi between my hands and I'm doing these movements, that as if gives me, again, maybe it's like a heuristic, it gives me a way of sort of anticipating movements or doing movements that I'm not sure I would have come up with otherwise. And so maybe if Bergson's doing something like that, maybe intuition then is, as Chase says, something along those lines that may offer us an opportunity to experience the world in a different way. And then maybe, like I'm earlier was raising this as a possibility, maybe then we can even intellectualize it in a different way, because that experience has given us a different way of even thinking about it, maybe. Okay, are we done? Sorry for the flames shooting out the facial orifices for a while there. I apologize for that.
It was exciting.
Yeah.
It was a good time.
I'd rather have the passion. Yeah. So, and I do apologize if my statements initially caused anybody to think I was trying to be a petty intellectual dictator and say thou shalt not. That wasn't my intent at all. So I very much appreciate you all weighing in because that's what I was hoping would happen from what I brought up.
Yeah, that's my job to be the dictator. So.
Hey, you're the one carrying the load of these meetings. So.
Actually, all I do is make up the schedule and the reading lists and send out the Zoom thing. That's one of the things I really like about these is, you know, we've got at least a group of people now that can really carry the conversation on their own. So my job is mostly administrative at this point. I'm a little worried in the future when, you know, people start going away and doing other things. You know, who knows what's going to happen. But right now, I don't actually have to do a whole lot of work in the actual meetings.
I do have to say, I think there really is something to be said about you orchestrating this to happen in the way it has, though. I just think that you have a way of kind of bringing out ideas out of people and you know, just encouraging people to talk and kind of not invalidating your own ideas, but just kind of bringing forth the conversation in a certain way. And I really do appreciate that. So I just want to say that.
Well, I'm glad to hear that because you know, frankly, the reason I do this is because this is one of my very favorite things to do. And that's pretty much my motivation. And so, but I'm glad you think that because you know, I want to be in the tradition of Socratic seminars. I don't know how much that's actually Socrates, but you know, the sort of University of Chicago, St. John's College mode of Socratic seminars, which really involves, you know, sort of takes seriously Socrates' claim that he wants to be a midwife more than a professor that professes something, someone that's a midwife that helps people give birth to ideas. So that's my real objective, is to, you know, have a chance to talk about these things and give people an opportunity to do that. So I really find it exciting when people are really authentically expressing their own understanding of things. That's just makes me happy. So thank you. Okay, we'll see you guys next week. Bye-bye.
All right.
Safe this
Bye,
week.
everyone.
Blown up by fireworks.